So, okay, guys, so we're gonna actually be joined with my wife, who, if you remember, is a professor of mechanical engineering at UD. So she teaches biomechanics classes, and I thought we would do a real world application um, for the forces and things that we've been learning about in our little physics segments. So her students are assigned a open-ended project looking at concussions and concussions in sports. So all my athletes, this should interest you. And so they focus on looking at helmets and helmet design. And they try to measure the forces that are going on during collision with a football helmet. And then also they're challenged with trying to find ways to lessen the forces that are going on inside the helmet and essentially inside your brain. So I'll pass it over to my wife. She's going to show us some parts from some of her student presentations and some video clips and ways that they actually build and test in class. So Kim, I give it to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So this is the work my students have been doing while they were originally in the classroom, and since we've gone on this alternative learning pathway, they've presented much of this work from home. So it's been fun to see them still working in teams and finishing up their projects. And they gave me permission to share some of their work with you. And so this seems like it might be a nice way to tie in the things that you've been learning. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So give me just a second to do that. All right. So as Mr. Bigelow was saying, I teach a junior level experimentation class. So we do all kinds of experimentation. And what we've spent the first half of our semester doing is looking at football helmets and football helmet design and how football helmets may be a way that we can prevent concussions. So when we talk about accelerations and velocities and forces, certainly that's exactly what we're measuring and looking at to try to decide if a football helmet is safe or not. Today, I'm going to share and kind of switch between a couple different presentations. So I had 10 different teams presenting. Carly, Caroline, Rachel, and Briley put together what I thought was a really nice presentation. And so you can also kind of see the work of some college students as we go along the way. Their goal was really to present to a group of football coaches and concerned parents, and the kind of fictitious statement they were trying to tackle was whether this pretend new helmet could prevent concussions or not, and they needed to do the experimental work to decide, but also take into account some other factors like how much the helmet might cost and whether it would be fair to give it to one team and not all teams and that kind of thing. So you'll see a little bit of that as we go through the presentation, but certainly you'll see the math and the physics at play too. One of the kind of neat things about this team in particular was that I did have 2 student athletes on the team. So Carly and Briley both play collegiate level sports, and Rachel and Caroline had played sports too. And I think it's always important to kind of remember what the background of the presenters are. And so towards the end, we'll talk all about helmets, but Carly is a goalkeeper for the soccer team. And despite soccer kind of dabbling in some headbands for concussions and that kind of thing, you'll see at the end of all of this that Carly found some research that instead of helmets being the solution, a mouth guard could be a solution. And even though we're thinking of football, she was really excited about that because she talked about all the other athletes outside of football players who might benefit from that kind of technology in a way that just improving a football helmet might not allow. So I think the background of who's presenting is always important. And you see some pictures, including from when they were pretty little, which is always fun. So what kind of generated this whole project was that many people by now realize that concussions are a problem. We decided to focus specifically on football, but there's lots of sports, and maybe even some of you have sustained concussions, either sporting related or other. But when we look at high school football, there are 67,000 diagnosed concussions every year, and those include probably much higher than that actual concussions, because not all of them are reported and appropriately counted. And it just talks about how concussion symptoms vary greatly. I've had a lot of students in my class who present who've had concussions during high school sporting, and they still say they have headaches, they have a hard time concentrating, they may have been hospitalized during that time that they sustained the concussion. And so it's a real thing, and it can be very devastating to a lot of people. And so there's been a lot of real world efforts. What I'm going to show you today is kind of our fictitious experimental take on it, but I also want to point out, and I'll show you some clips of what's real. And there's a lot of people thinking helmets are part of the solution, and every day there's new helmet designs trying to make the helmet safer to help prevent concussions. And just so you kind of know that the pretend problem I gave our students was that there's some fictitious company I'm calling Helmets for Better Brain Health, and that they've invented this new helmet, and they claim that their helmet reduces the force of impact by an average of 40% and up to 90% compared to conventional helmets. So later when we get into seeing some of the results that the students created, you can keep those numbers in mind. But because we're talking about how helmets might be part of the solution, I thought even though I'm giving you a fictitious kind of example today, I wanted to show you some real world examples. And so let me pull up this video clip real quick. And this is one that a number of my students looked a lot at. And what's neat about this particular company's helmet is that they talk about the engineering and the physics that go into it that really do reduce the force, and why does it happen, and what does force mean, and what does acceleration mean. And just kind of watch this. It's a little bit on the long side at 4 minutes, but I think it'll be enjoyable to see what the real world scientists and researchers are doing. And this helmet did go out to market, and then we'll talk about how just recently the company went out of business, but that's a different story. So let's go ahead and play this.
Crumple zones, airbags, crash detection. We're fully okay with sacrificing an entire automobile to save the passengers. If you compare the innovation in the automotive industry with innovation in football helmets, we're way behind. They're basically like cars from the 70s. A hard shell, padding on the inside. Good luck.
Football and sports in general are really important to America and American society.
I love football, man. I can't get enough of it.
First memory of playing football was back in Pensacola, Florida, Salvation Army. The heat was unbearable.
And I'm looking at this ball comes straight to me, and I take off like a little rabbit, man.
Football's taught me a lot.
You learn how to trust one another.
Perseverance, hard work.
Mostly about not quitting, not giving up.
You learn how to become a team player.
Sports really teach you the importance of someone other than yourself.
Unfortunately, that great formative experience is at risk because of safety concerns, real safety concerns.
Any concussion is a concussion too many. Concussions continue to be a very common event, especially in football.
If nothing is done, if this concussion problem is not addressed, I think the game is in danger.
If I put my kid out there in Pop Warner Pee Wee football and he's getting banged into the head, that could be a hurdle for him to overcome for the rest of his life.
The existing helmet companies aren't innovating fast enough. Their innovation has been incremental. This is not an incremental problem. This is a major public health problem. We need to solve this issue of sports-related concussion. We're not attacking this like we're a sporting goods company. We're attacking this problem like we're a technology company, bringing in the latest thinking from engineering, medicine, and sport.
Vices is a perfect example of not accepting a problem. We take a step back and start with a clean sheet of paper.
Build out the very best helmet using the best and latest technology that would be out there.
It's going to take breakthrough thinking, an entirely reimagined helmet.
Since we started from a clean sheet of paper with this helmet design, we have had to rely on extensive testing and computer modeling. We have the impact absorbing layer, which consists of columns or filaments. During deformation, these rods deform and eventually buckle.
They move omnidirectionally. They can respond to impacts from any angle and any location.
We wanted a helmet that deformed locally at the impact location.
The helmet fits extremely well. The pressure is uniform. It's going to result in more safety. This is a multi-layered, highly engineered solution, and it will make a difference. Typical helmet with a hard shell and some padding on the inside. We can reduce acceleration. We can make a difference, and it's because we've come about this in such a profoundly different way.
BICES. Protect the athlete, elevate the game.
So I just wanted to show that to kind of give an example of some of the real world efforts that are going on to make helmets safer and very different than what you might see today. BICES actually just went out of business. Their price point was about $900 or more per helmet. And so while it was gaining some traction in the NFL, it just wasn't sustainable. But certainly their helmet technology is really quite something, and so there's now other investors looking to maybe buy the company and see that technology through. But kind of interesting just to see for a very short while they were the best of the best, and their helmet technology is still kind of thought to be so. That said, they mentioned a couple things. I don't know if you saw that formula pop up, F equals ma, so force equals mass times acceleration, and we'll talk about that when we look at my students' results. They talked about acceleration and showed some of those plots, and that's really what they wanted to change, and we'll talk about what that looks like and give you some examples. But I also, just as you watch that video, want to point out, you know, all of the people at the beginning talked about the benefits of football, and I talk to my students a lot about that because we could just say no one should play, but that might really upset if your audience is sitting there all football coaches and families who've lived and grown up playing football. That's not the only option. So you heard all the great things they talked about that they learned from sport. And so here, if we can make helmets safer and recognize that football has benefits, that's a nice balance. So one of the important things as we think about all of this is we kind of know a hit causes a concussion, but a hit of what kind of size and how do we quantify that? So my students did quite a bit of research to find out what's already out there. And it turns out that the measurement that we're most concerned about when deciding if someone has sustained a concussion or not is the acceleration of the hit. And so that magic number is often 95 Gs or greater will cause a concussion. And so you see that letter G in there, and it might look familiar when you were learning potential energy. We saw that potential energy equals mgh, G standing for gravity. And so that's the same G that was in that equation. So it's how many gravities, basically, are causing the acceleration. So this G is actually a number. It's 9.81 meters per second squared. And so we can multiply 95 by that. But it's more common just to go ahead and keep it as a G, not call it 9.81. And so here we know that the magic number is 95 Gs or more cause concussions to most individuals. And kind of an interesting comparative fact is that in the NFL, the average football player receives 103 Gs when hit during a game. So you can imagine that there's probably a pretty high likelihood of sustaining a concussion by many players and even just a typical NFL game. Chris, any questions so far? Anything that you want to add?
No, I mean, I think that this is tying in very well with what we've learned and gives a nice real world example.
We won't go through all these facts, but just kind of so you know, you all did the science fair. It's kind of similar when we do experimentation at the college level. And so they started with background information, and you can kind of see this as an example of they thought about things they didn't know and looked them up so that they had all the background knowledge that they thought would be important. And we already saw this fact that there was 67,000 diagnosed concussions in high school football every year. They also got kind of creative, and so they thought about, in this case, what kind of animal hits its head very hard and very often, and as far as we know, does not get concussions, and do we know anything about why? So in the engineering world, the term is biomimicry, and so we think about, can we design something to be like an animal or another living thing that has kind of optimized through evolution or whatever else its abilities. And in this case, they looked at rams and found out that rams can actually slow the blood flow from their head, and doing so can help kind of create a protection. And so researchers have taken that idea and created neck cushions, which can kind of do the same thing for football helmets, or not football helmets, but football players. And so you'll see some people using cue collars and other neck kind of protections that try to help them be more like a ram. It's important to think about what's causing the concussions when we set up our own experiments so that we can mimic them correctly. And so this group looked and found that 45% of concussions occurred on helmet to body hits and 35 were helmet to helmet, so a little less prevalent. And that was important when they were trying to decide whether their setup should include a helmet hitting another helmet or something else. And then just, what exactly is a concussion? And you can do all kinds of research into this and the anatomy around it. But it's basically once hit, the brain sliding around and hitting the inside walls of the skull, beginning to affect brain function and some swelling and things like that. And so at that point, what my students do, kind of like your science fair, is see what kind of setups they might want for their own experiment, and they like to go to other previous research that has done similar things. And so in our case, it was interesting because there was a couple really well-known papers already published, very different from each other. And so they looked at that, and one was more of a swinging pendulum kind of hit that you see here. And then one was more of a drop test. And so that head that you see would have just fallen and hit that stationary object. And so the teams thought a lot about why one might have been better than another. And that's kind of what they're showing there.
This is the football helmet drop test.
We
Football
also
helmet is
look at standards that exist, and this is kind of cool in the engineering world because there's published procedures that tell you how you should test things, and as long as you follow those, you would be in kind of alignment with the industry. So ASTM are some testing standards, and this shows you that a drop test is most common. It was also really interesting to me and to the students that these standards told us very specific things about whether the helmet should be tested with a face mask on or off, whether it should be tested under multiple temperatures or just one, whether it should be hit in different areas. And so it really lays out, if you ever need to test a football helmet, kind of federal regulation wise, here's what you should do. We'll just go ahead, and I wasn't sure if I'd play this or not, but we will play this little clip here. What it's going to show is the official testing setup. So you saw earlier in the other video kind of the helmet design. Well, this shows you the testing that goes into testing helmets, whether they're new or whether they're old. of any kind. NOCSAE, N-O-C-S-A-E, is actually a standard that most of the football coaches in the area would know. Back on the back of the helmet, even helmets that you might have at home probably have that little symbol that it's been NOCSAE certified. And so if something's NOCSAE certified, it's gone through this procedure that he'll talk about here.
This is the football helmet drop test. The football helmet is actually dropped, and the instrumentation inside the head form tells us how that helmet performed in that test. There are levels that the helmet has to perform at. If the helmet's cushioning system is doing a good job, then the G-forces will be below those known to cause injury. That's what we're measuring. And we do that in many different spots on the helmet, at many different drop heights on the helmet to make sure the helmet is consistent in its performance over a very wide range. There are also very strict quality control guidelines so that when the athlete puts the helmet on and he sees that logo, that NOCSAE certification logo on the back of the helmet, he knows that that helmet has been through this rigorous protocol, and it is the best opportunity you have to keep yourself protected on the field.
Chris, anything else so far?
Nope.
Okay. So now we're to the point of actually, okay, my students want to build their own test rig and test a traditional helmet versus this kind of fictitious made-up helmet that I've given them. And they had to decide what sensor was going to allow them to make those measurements. And as you've heard in all the videos so far, we keep talking about the importance of acceleration. So the way to measure acceleration is using a tiny chip right here. It's about the size, I know there's no point of reference there, but about the size of a quarter. It's really little, so it can go wherever. You need to connect it to a readout. So these aren't wireless. And we need to pick the right one. And so accelerometers come in all different kinds of what we would call a range. So we need to make sure that our sensor is going to be able to measure when we drop the helmet. Knowing that from before in the background research, you saw that they found hits were often about 103 Gs. They wanted to make sure that they picked a sensor that could measure at least 103 Gs. Otherwise, the sensor wouldn't be big enough. And so this one here is a 200 G accelerometer. That means it can measure 200 Gs. And again, a G is 9.81 meter per second squared. And so this is the one all of the groups ended up using. And it's going to measure your acceleration in a linear direction. So whatever way I point it, if I have it fall down, it's going to measure right along that fall path. And so that's really important, and I'm going to measure that for us. I guess I'll just mention, it's super important for me and my students. Just so you know, sensors and every measurement you take, even in your own science fair and whatever else, you can be as accurate as you want, as polished and consistent, but no sensor is perfect. And so every sensor will have a little bit of uncertainty, and we can actually figure out ahead of time how off that sensor might be. And based on these students' calculations, if whatever they measure when the football hits to be 90, they might be off by 3.6. So it might be 93.6 or 90 minus 3.6. And so it just kind of tells you what range you're in. And obviously the smaller that number is, the better. And normally that comes with a cost. You have to buy a little bit more of an expensive sensor to be more accurate. I always have my students think up some different ways that they might carry out their experiment. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but you're going to see some pretty interesting pictures here. So this one was being hit by a hydraulic ram. This one was a swinging pendulum kind of impact where the helmet would swing down and hit a stationary pad. This one was a drop test where it would drop off of a PVC helmet, and it could be dropped onto different surfaces. It could be carried outside and dropped onto the grass, and the helmet could be rotated into different directions. And then this one was similar, but it had 2 PVC to try to control the drop a little bit better. And they thought maybe that might make it a little more stable and safe and more consistent drop timing might be a little harder because both would have to drop at the same time. So in engineering, there's this way to decide which one is the best. So they put their numbers in and they thought about some different factors, and they ended up deciding that the double PVC drop, this one here, was the one that made most sense to move forward with. And so they went ahead and started building that. I'm gonna stop these for a second, maybe. All right. Go back. So they went ahead, they built their tester in both cases. Here's a kind of picture of what they built. So they put a styrofoam head form, kind of a mannequin head, into the football helmet so that it looked like a head. And they carved out a little piece in that head to fit that accelerometer sensor that we talked about. And then what's going to happen is that they're going to do some different drops where the helmet will fall. And when it's falling, it's in free fall. So when we think about physics, it doesn't really matter what's going on at that point. Your measurements of acceleration are probably all going to be just your free fall. And so what we really care about is the impact. And there's a lot that's going to play into that impact and what the acceleration is when it impacts. But acceleration is really the change in velocity over time. And so if our velocity changes really, really quick, we have a very high acceleration. If our velocity changes more slowly, that can reduce our acceleration. And so that will become really important if we don't want the 100 Gs. We want to try and slow down our velocities. And so as it hits, can we do something that keeps the helmet in contact for longer, gives it time to kind of deform and things like that, just like you saw in the Visus helmet. So let's look at what they did. And we see here the helmet falling traditionally, and it falls and it just kind of smacks. It's a very quick impact. And then here, what we did, again, this was fictitious, so we kind of had to make it work. We pretended this was the better company, and we mimicked what would have happened inside the helmet by taping big green squishy foam to the outside of the helmet. So you see as it lands, all of that landing impact or force is now kind of going through the green foam, which is pretty thick. It's in contact for longer, it kind of squishes down for longer, so it's giving us more time of the impact. And more time means the acceleration changes more slowly, and that or the velocity changes more slowly, and so we get less acceleration when it impacts here compared to this very instantaneous kind of bounce that we see. And so that we have numbers for because we put that sensor in. So this group looked at both the front of the helmet, and then they changed where their helmet was. They looked at the back of the helmet, and they looked at the top of the helmet. And just to show you one more example so you kind of see what I mean. So this is while things were falling. We see nothing's really changing, but as soon as it hits the ground, there's a big, huge spike. This would be found. We see it very, very noticeably. You'll notice that this says voltage, not acceleration. We kind of have to do a little mathematical conversion, but the same thing, this corresponds to a big peak, and that's where the impact has happened. So let's look at the results. So here we see the top of the helmet. And so when the original helmet was dropped, the helmet with no padding, the one that many people are probably wearing, we found out that the G-force was 120. So most of those drops would have caused a concussion based on the fact they'd found that 95 Gs is often where concussions occur. So then they put that foam padding on and they dropped it more times, and they found that there was a reduction, which is what we were hoping would happen. And that foam ended up causing the impact forces to be about 60. And so to go from 120 Gs to 60 Gs was a really good thing. In the real world, this would have probably meant people getting the same kind of hits would not receive a concussion. And they did some math here to denote that the percent reduction, so how much lower it was 54%. So pretty good reduction. You also see these little bars here. They calculated the standard deviation. So you see that that's pretty tiny, meaning every one of their 5 trials was pretty consistent and they were getting very similar measurements. They then looked at the back of the helmet. And so the old helmet ended up being about 160 Gs, so well above your concussion threshold. And then when you put the foam on and you pretended that was the new helmet, you were down to about 80. So again, about a 51% reduction. So that new helmet is definitely better. It's also below the concussion threshold again, so that would probably be a good sign. But interestingly, when you compare the back of the helmet at 160 to the top of the helmet, I learned with them, you know, about football helmets, and different ones are made differently, but it just kind of seems that maybe the back of the helmet doesn't have the same amount of protection that the top of the helmet does, and that might be important to helmet manufacturers. And then they looked at the front of the helmet, dropping the helmet on kind of the face mask, and found that the old helmet ended up being 140 Gs, and then with the foam that went down to about 70 Gs. So again, below the concussive threshold and a reduction of about 50%. So this was really important data for us to find out. They just made a little note down here. They did some statistics and they found out not only are these big differences, but they actually do matter. So statistics tell us that there was a real difference between the old and new helmet in every condition. One of the things, and when we're talking about results, you'll see that they put G-force, and I know you're learning about force, and again, when we think about Newton's laws, force equals mass times acceleration. G-force is kind of an improper terminology. Everyone uses it, but G-force is actually an acceleration. And so even though you see that word force in there, that is meaning acceleration, parenthesis, units of Gs. And so we could, if we still wanted to calculate the physical impact force, we would take this number that you see here, so about 120, and then we would multiply by our 9.81 because that's the G, and then we'd have to multiply by the mass of the helmet and the head and whatever was being dropped, and that would give us our impact force. And in the VISIS video, they talked about the average force of a hit being about 1 ton. Well, that's how they would have gotten that number. So just kind of interesting that we might use force in this case, or you might hear about G-forces, but those are different than the big F in your equation of F equals ma being a mechanical or impact force. Chris, you wanna add anything, clarify anything, tie it into any of the physics you're doing?
Well, just looking back, I mean, you don't need to click back, but when you had the testing rig set up, the drawing of it, you know, when the helmet's being held up there, last week we talked about potential energy. Well, at that point, it's at rest, it's not doing anything. And so it's all potential energy sitting there. And then when it's moving down, it's dropping, that potential energy is changing into kinetic energy until right before it hits, it's all kinetic energy. And then we're back to potential energy, and it's really, how was the helmet controlling that energy? You know, what's it being converted into? We talked about a conservation of energy. The energy doesn't really go away, it just moves from one form to another. And so, you know, that's what they're looking at, is how are we changing that and controlling those forces and ultimately protecting your brain.
And that's exactly, I had my students calculate ahead of time mathematically what to expect, and many of them did potential energy and kinetic energy equations, and talk about energy can't really be lost. And so even my college students were using those same simple equations to try to estimate what kinds of velocities and accelerations to expect. so kind of that we're doing the same thing more. Anything else?
Nope, I think I'm good.
Okay, so let me just wrap up. So then, of course, what the students have to do is say, okay, we found out that this new helmet reduced impact by 50%. That sounds great. And they're going to tell the audience, okay, should these football coaches and parents who care so much buy the new football helmet? And so this is always fun just to kind of hear all the different things that go into that decision. And so we don't have to go through everything, but you know, the team does say, well, it did match the claims that were given of reducing at least 40%. That's good. The old helmet reached concussion causing accelerations while the new helmet did not. So that was also good. The study did not analyze the impact of head rotation. And so that's important. We're talking about acceleration and linear acceleration. So right sliding down, you saw how that dropped. It's thought that for concussions, it's very important to also get the angular velocity, so the movement kind of the swinging, and that would have required a different sensor that they didn't have access to, and so they felt that that was important to study, but something that they just weren't able to do in this particular project. They thought that the data was precise. You saw those. They feel that there might be other approaches going on right now in the world that might be an even better option than just buying expensive helmets. And so they wanted to look at that. They also thought it was important to point out that in this fictitious example, each helmet was $500, and they were told that the players would have to replace them every year. And so they estimated, based on research, that a youth football team could have anywhere from 11 to 60 players. So that might mean that you need $30,000 per year to buy your team helmets. And they talked about how that could be unfeasible and just unfair to schools of different economic abilities and that sort of thing. And then they also looked at things that were being done right now. And so they found a lot of work being done by John Madden, who is very well known in the football world, being a Hall of Fame football coach. And he's actually argued that kids should not play tackle football until they're 12 years old or older. And he's really promoted flag football. And so then the students looked into that and found out that even flag football is starting to require headgear, so the head is still protected, but that headgear only costs $20 to $40. And they felt that if they were really talking to parents and coaches, they might say that young kids could learn football without parents feeling the need to pay the $500 helmets to keep their kids safe. So just another kind of interesting thought and option. And then I mentioned at the beginning this mouth guard, and so there's actually a researcher right now has done all kinds of really cool work with putting the sensors that you saw us put in the football helmet into a mouth guard. And because the mouth guard is bitten by the teeth and kind of directly connected to the skull, when that impact occurs, they're able to really collect good data and then put a pretend computer simulated brain in and understand what happens. And so there's a lot of research being done right now with using the mouth guard just to figure out why concussions are occurring and when they occur, but assumably it's this whole project more about any sport rather than just football, because there's a lot of athletes who and so their concluding remarks were interesting, because despite the helmet results showing so much promise, this particular team said at this point they would not recommend the new helmet, just because they thought $500 per helmet per season without knowing how it would affect that rotational movements didn't seem to make sense unless they did more research looking at that too, or the price came down quite a bit. But I just thought, we kind of simulated all that Visus is doing, and the NOXI testing standards that you saw in that video. We did it that you saw acceleration, you saw force, you saw velocities, and hopefully potential and kinetic energy too. So kind of brings in everything we're doing and mimics your science fair projects a little bit. That's all I have, Chris.
All right, well, thank you.
Anything else?
No, thank you very much.